Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we've got some sources that might seem a little all over the place at first glance.
hmm
We're looking at Islamic economics and then minority representation specifically in Iran, and then we're going to be diving into the world of quantum physics and how it relates to faith.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at the sources together, they actually all deal with this concept of systems,
Of course.
whether that's economic systems or social systems, or even, diving deep down into the systems that make up reality itself.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I'm really interested to see how those connections kind of play out. So why don't we start with this mathematical model that looks at the concept of Zakat.
Okay.
Now, for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar, Zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and it's this idea of mandatory charitable giving. So usually calculated at about 2.5% of a person's wealth.
Right.
And full disclosure, when I saw a mathematical model, I was a little bit intimidated. I thought this is going to be some dry equations and stuff, but
Right.
it was actually really interesting.
Yeah, it's a really cool model because what it does is it takes this concept of zakat, which a lot of people see as just this kind of religious or moral obligation, and it translates it into a quantifiable system.
Okay.
So they use these equations with variables like earning ratios, which is basically how much someone earns relative to others, and zakat ratios to simulate how wealth would flow through different parts of the population.
So it's not just like a theoretical thing. It's like they're actually trying to map out what would happen
Exactly.
in different scenarios.
Exactly. Yeah, it gets very specific. It predicts how long it would take under certain conditions for someone to cross like the richness limit. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so like a roadmap almost
Yeah.
to different economic outcomes.
Exactly.
What was it about the findings in the model that really stood out to you?
I think one of the most compelling things was that it found that consistent zakat implementation could not only reduce the gap between the rich and poor, but it could actually lead to scenarios where extreme wealth becomes mathematically improbable over time.
Oh, wow.
So almost like this built-in mechanism for economic equilibrium.
So it's not just about like the individual act of charity, but the
Mhm.
fact that this is a system that could ripple outwards
Exactly.
and affect the entire society.
Yeah, it's like a system-level approach to wealth redistribution.
And that's actually something that the paper touches on too. It mentions that the model's predictions like absolutely line up with real-world observations of Zakat's impact
Yeah.
on things like poverty reduction.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a growing body of research that suggests that implementing zakat correlates with positive socioeconomic outcomes.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a complex issue. There's a lot of factors at play. But this model provides like a really interesting framework for understanding zakat's potential to, create more equitable societies.
Yeah, right. And it definitely makes you think about the systems that we have in place now
Yeah.
and whether they're designed in a way that actually allows for like widespread prosperity.
Right.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. We're going to move from economics into the world of education. This analysis of Iranian textbooks brought us some really interesting points about representation, particularly when it comes to minorities within an Islamic state.
Yeah, I think the most striking thing for me about this analysis wasn't just the sheer dominance of Islamic themes in the textbooks,
Right.
which, in a predominantly Islamic country isn't entirely surprising, but the stark underrepresentation of other religious perspectives. So, Christianity and Judaism receive very little attention, and even the Sunni sect of Islam, which is a significant minority in Iran, is largely absent from the curriculum.
Yeah, and it wasn't just in any subject. It was especially noticeable in the textbooks that were titled Holy Gifts,
Oh.
which you would think would be like a natural place to introduce different faiths, sacred texts. But they found that these books were almost exclusively focused on the Quran, and other scriptures were basically invisible.
It's this absence that the authors call like the eloquent silence of ideology that I think is really important to pay attention to.
Okay.
It's one thing to teach about your own faith, but to systematically exclude other beliefs creates what they call an imagined community where students might not even be aware of the diversity of beliefs that exist.
And so it kind of makes you think like, what is the goal of education?
Right.
Is it to, foster critical thinking and exposure to different perspectives, or is it to reinforce one specific worldview?
Right. It's a complex issue, and it's one that exists beyond Iran. Every education system is dealing with these questions of representation and inclusion.
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that what's left unsaid can be just as powerful as what's explicitly taught.
Yeah.
Okay, now get ready for a really big shift here, because we're going to enter the world of quantum physics. This last paper explores the question of whether quantum mechanics can actually help us understand faith in the unseen.
It's a really interesting idea, and the author makes a compelling argument that those principles that make quantum physics so strange and counterintuitive,
Right.
they might actually offer a framework for understanding concepts that have always been relegated to the realm of faith.
Quantum physics is not exactly the easiest thing to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
So can you give us like a crash course in some of the key ideas that the paper links to faith?
Sure. So one of the most important concepts in quantum mechanics is this idea of superposition.
Okay.
And this means that a particle can exist in multiple states at the same time until it's observed. So it's kind of like a coin spinning in the air. It's both heads and tails until the moment it lands.
Right.
And it's only through observing it that those possibilities collapse into a single outcome.
So it's not just that we don't know, it's that it's actually existing in multiple states at once.
Exactly. Okay, that already is kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So how does that connect?
So that ties into this idea of wave function collapse, which means that the act of observation influences the outcome.
Okay.
It's like reality itself is being shaped by our perception of it.
Wow.
And then you have quantum entanglement,
Hmm.
where two particles can be linked across vast distances, and they can influence each other instantaneously.
Hmm.
So imagine like an invisible thread connecting them that defies our normal ideas of space and time.
Okay, my brain is starting to hurt a little bit here.
Yeah.
But I'm intrigued. How does the paper connect these quantum phenomena to faith in the unseen?
Well, the author argues that this inherent uncertainty, this non-locality, and this interconnectedness that we see in quantum mechanics provides a new way of thinking about the concept of the unseen.
Okay.
And it challenges that assumption that what we can perceive with our senses is all that there is to reality.
So instead of seeing the unseen as something supernatural or mystical.
It could be that it's actually operating according to these principles that we're only starting to understand now.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that the paper goes beyond just the abstract, and it applies this quantum lens to some specific stories from the Quran, and it offers some really interesting interpretations that I think will surprise people, even if they're familiar with these stories.
All right, well, in that case, let's dive into those stories and see what happens when we bring ancient wisdom and cutting-edge science together.
Sounds good. So the first story that the paper looks at is the encounter between Moses and Al-Qid.
Okay.
And as you remember, Al-Qidr has this kind of mystical knowledge, and he does things that Moses, who's a prophet himself, can't really understand.
Yeah, it's a classic story about hidden wisdom and trusting in a plan that you might not see right away.
Right, exactly.
I'm curious to see how quantum physics ties into this.
Well, the paper suggests that maybe we can understand Al-Qidr's actions, the things that seem random or even harmful from Moses's perspective through this idea of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics.
Okay, so for people who don't know a lot about quantum physics, what is the many worlds interpretation?
Basically, it proposes that every time there's a quantum measurement, every time this wave function collapses, the universe splits into multiple possibilities.
So it's not just one fixed timeline, it's all these different parallel universes branching out
Exactly.
with each event.
Yeah, and so what the paper is suggesting is that maybe Al-Qidr is somehow aware of these other worlds
Whoa.
and acting in accordance with a larger cosmic plan that takes all of these possibilities into account.
So he's like operating on a different level of reality almost.
Yeah, it's like he's got this awareness of the interconnectedness of all these branching realities, while Moses is still limited to his own perspective within one branch.
It's definitely making me rethink that story.
Yeah, it's a very thought-provoking interpretation.
What other stories does the paper look at through this quantum lens?
Well, another example is the story of Joseph and Jacob.
Okay.
You know the one where Jacob, who had lost his sight?
Right.
He's miraculously healed when they place Joseph's shirt on his face.
It's such a powerful moment of connection.
Yeah, it really is. And it's often interpreted as this kind of divine intervention.
Right.
Yeah.
I never would have thought to connect that to quantum physics.
Well, the paper makes a connection between this instantaneous healing across a huge distance and the idea of quantum entanglement.
Okay.
So just as these entangled particles can influence each other instantaneously no matter how far apart they are, maybe there's a similar connection between Joseph and Jacob, a kind of non-local connection that goes beyond our normal understanding of cause and effect.
So instead of just divine power, We could also see it as this example of quantum interconnectedness, which is
Exactly.
something we're only beginning to understand scientifically.
Right. It's not about replacing one explanation with another. It's more about expanding how we interpret these stories.
To include all these possibilities that quantum mechanics is revealing.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really interesting. It's
Yeah.
like these ancient stories are hiding these secrets about the universe that we're only now starting to unlock with science.
Yeah. And the last example that the paper explores is the story of Solomon's death and the jinn.
Okay.
So, the jinn, they were enslaved by Solomon to build his temple,
Uh-huh.
and they don't even realize that he's dead until his staff that was holding him up collapses.
Right. It's like their whole reality shifts in that moment.
Exactly. And the paper compares this to the idea of quantum superposition and wave function collapse.
Okay.
It's like the jinn were experiencing a different world, one where Solomon was still alive,
Right.
until that collapse of the staff forced them to see a different reality, kind of like when observing a particle collapses its wave function into one specific state.
So it's like these two parallel realities were coexisting until something happened to merge them together.
Exactly. And it raises some really big questions about how we perceive reality and the limits of our understanding.
This whole deep dive is really making me think about the world in a new way.
Me too.
We've looked at these systems that influence economic equality. We've talked about representation in education, and we've even gone into the world of quantum physics and how it relates to faith.
And if you look at all these different topics, there's this underlying theme of there being more to reality than we see on the surface.
Right, like these hidden systems that are working in the background.
Exactly.
Whether it's economic systems or these unseen realms in quantum physics,
Right.
the world is way more complex and interconnected than we often think.
Yeah. And it's not just about recognizing that complexity. It's about realizing that we have a role to play in those systems.
Yeah, we're not just passive observers.
Yeah.
We can actually shape the world around us.
Exactly.
Before we go any further, I think there's another area from the materials we should touch on,
Okay.
which is the Hizmet movement's approach to education.
Okay. Yeah.
It seems to fit in with a lot of the themes we've been discussing.
Absolutely. So the Hizmet movement, they're inspired by the teachings of Fethullah Gulen.
Right.
And they really emphasize education as this powerful tool for creating peace and understanding between cultures.
I'm seeing how it connects back to what we were talking about with textbooks in Iran.
Yeah.
It's like instead of focusing on one worldview, they're trying to create a space for understanding across differences.
Exactly. Their schools often serve very diverse communities, and they bring together students from all different backgrounds.
It's really breaking down those walls, those imagined communities that we talked about earlier.
Right. And it's helping to create a more inclusive and empathetic world.
What's really inspiring to me is that they're doing this work in some of the most challenging places imaginable.
Yeah.
Conflict zones,
Yeah.
areas with a lot of poverty, places with deep societal divisions.
Yeah.
It's like they're planting seeds of peace in the most difficult soil.
And there's a lot of evidence that their approach is making a real difference.
Oh, wow.
Studies have shown that their schools actually help to reduce prejudice, promote harmony between faiths,
That's amazing.
and foster this culture of peace.
It really shows how education can be this force for good,
Yeah.
not just teaching facts, but shaping people's hearts and minds. Okay, so the Hizmet movement is basically a living example of how we can build systems
Right.
that create a better world.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we're not just stuck with the systems we inherit. We can actively participate in shaping the kind of world we want to see.
We have the power to make choices to create systems that are just and compassionate.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've gone from Islamic economics to minority representation in Iran.
Right.
And we've even explored the mind-boggling world of quantum physics and its connection to faith.
What I think is so fascinating is that even though these sources seem so different, they all point to this idea that there's more to reality than what we initially see.
Absolutely. Whether it's the economic systems that drive inequality or the unseen dimensions explored by quantum physics and faith, the message seems to be that the world is more complex and interconnected than we often realize.
And it's not just about recognizing that complexity. It's about understanding that we have a role to play within these systems.
Right? We can choose to be passive observers, or we can actively participate in shaping the world around us.
Exactly. And, the mathematical model of Zakat shows us how we can create systems that promote economic justice. The analysis of Iranian textbooks highlights the importance of representation and inclusion in education.
Yeah.
And the paper on quantum physics and faith encourages us to rethink the limits of what we think is possible, to be open to these unseen forces that are shaping our reality.
Speaking of the unseen, the quantum physics paper actually touches on another really fascinating concept,
Oh, yeah.
the role of consciousness in shaping reality,
Right.
which is an idea that's been debated for centuries in philosophy and spirituality.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see it explored through modern science.
Yeah, it's a very mind-boggling concept. Quantum physics already challenges our normal understanding of cause and effect.
Right.
But then to think that our consciousness might actually play a role in collapsing the wave function and influencing the outcome of these quantum events, it takes it to a whole new level.
So are we saying that our thoughts can directly affect the physical world?
Well, the paper doesn't make any definitive claims,
Right.
but it presents this really compelling case for the interconnectedness of consciousness and the material world.
So it's possible that our minds aren't separate from reality, but actually an integral part of how it unfolds.
Yeah.
And that kind of reminds me of the concept of intentionality that you find in a lot of spiritual traditions.
Right.
The idea that our thoughts and beliefs and actions, they create these ripple effects
Exactly.
that shape not just our own lives, but the world around us.
It goes back to that central message that we've been talking about throughout this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're not just powerless bystanders.
I have agency.
We have the ability to make choices, to act with intention, and to contribute to a world that reflects our values.
Whether that's by designing fairer economic systems,
Yeah.
advocating for more inclusive education,
Yeah.
or cultivating a consciousness that recognizes how interconnected everything is. We have the power to create a world that is more just compassionate and harmonious.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey, exploring all these connections between ideas that seemed so different at first.
It has been a lot of fun.
But I think what we've seen is that there's this hidden unity, this common thread running through these sources. It's a reminder that knowledge isn't meant to be separated into these neat little boxes. It's
Well,
all connected.
It's all one big web.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a privilege to delve into these fascinating sources with you.
Likewise.
And to our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep exploring, to keep asking questions, and to keep making those connections between ideas that spark your curiosity.
Yeah.
The world is full of mystery and wonder, so embrace the unknown, stay curious, and keep those deep dives going. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
Yeah, we have.
We've gone from Islamic economics to minority representation in Iran,
Uh-huh.
and we've even explored the mind-boggling world of quantum physics and its connection to faith.
It's amazing how these sources that seem so different on the surface
Right.
actually all point to this idea that there's more to reality than meets the eye.
Absolutely. Whether it's hidden economic systems that are driving inequality or these unseen realms that quantum physics and faith are exploring,
Right.
the message seems to be that the world is way more complex and interconnected than we often realize.
And it's not just about acknowledging that complexity.
Right.
It's about understanding that we have a role to play within those systems.
Right. We're not just passive observers. We can
Yeah.
actively participate in shaping the world around us.
Exactly. And, the mathematical model of Zakat shows us how we can create systems that promote economic justice. The analysis of Iranian textbooks highlights how important representation and inclusion are in education.
Yeah.
And the paper on quantum physics and faith encourages us to rethink the limits of what we think is possible, to be open to these unseen forces that are shaping our reality.
Speaking of the unseen, the quantum physics paper also touches on another really interesting concept: the role of consciousness in shaping reality.
Right.
It's an idea that has been debated for centuries in philosophy and spirituality,
Yeah.
but it's really interesting to see how modern science is starting to explore it.
Yeah, it's a mind-boggling concept. Quantum physics already challenges our normal understanding of cause and effect, but then to think that our consciousness might actually have a role in collapsing the wave function, in influencing the outcome of these quantum events, that takes it to a whole new level.
So are we saying that our thoughts can directly affect the physical world?
Well, the paper doesn't make any definitive claims, but it presents a really compelling case for this interconnectedness of consciousness and the material world.
So it's possible that our minds aren't actually separate from reality,
Yeah.
but an integral part of how it unfolds.
It's
That reminds me of the concept of intentionality in a lot of spiritual traditions.
Right.
This idea that our thoughts and beliefs and actions, they create these ripple effects
Exactly.
that shape not just our own lives, but the world around us.
It goes back to that central message that we've been discussing throughout this deep dive. We're not just powerless bystanders. We have agency.
Right.
We have the ability to make choices, to act with intention, and to contribute to a world that reflects our values.
Whether that's by designing fair economic systems, advocating for more inclusive education, or cultivating a consciousness that recognizes how interconnected everything is.
Exactly.
We have the power to create a world that is just more compassionate and more harmonious.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey, exploring all these connections between ideas that seem so different at first.
It really
But
has.
I think what we've seen is that there's this hidden unity, this common thread running through all of these sources.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that knowledge isn't meant to be separated into these neat little boxes. It's all connected.
All one big web.
Exactly.
Well, it has been an absolute privilege to delve into these fascinating sources with you.
That
And to our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep exploring, to keep asking questions, and to keep making those connections between ideas that spark your curiosity.
Yeah.
The world is full of mystery and wonder. Embrace the unknown, stay curious, and keep those deep dives going.